What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Denzel Washington and Stephen Colbert clashed over Hollywood's political activism, leading to the most explosive walkout in talk show history. The studio lights dimmed as Stephen Colbert adjusted his tie, flashing his trademark smirk toward the cameras. The Late Show was running its usual Monday night format, but tonight felt different. There was an electric tension in the air that even the production crew could sense. Denzel Washington, Hollywood royalty and two-time Academy Award winner, sat across from Colbert in the guest chair, his posture straight and dignified as always. "We're back with the incomparable Denzel Washington," Colbert announced to the live audience, his voice carrying that familiar theatrical cadence. "Denzel, you've been in this business for decades, and I have to ask about something that's been making headlines. There's been a lot of talk about actors staying in their lane when it comes to politics. What's your take on celebrities using their platforms to speak out?" Denzel's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that most viewers might have missed, but the seasoned actor was already reading between the lines. "Well, Stephen, I think every American has the right to express their views. That's what makes this country great. But I also believe in doing your homework before you speak on issues that affect real people's lives." Colbert leaned forward, his smile becoming more pointed. "That's interesting because you've been pretty vocal about certain issues yourself. Some might say you've been quite political lately, especially with your recent comments about the education system and family values. Aren't you doing exactly what you're criticizing other celebrities for?" The audience sensed the shift in tone, the applause dying down as an uncomfortable silence settled over the studio. Denzel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I think there's a difference between speaking from experience and speaking from a script, Stephen. When I talk about education, it's because I've seen what happens in underserved communities. When I talk about family, it's because I've raised children and understand the challenges parents face. But isn't that a bit hypocritical?" Colbert pressed, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You criticize celebrities for being political, yet you've made statements that clearly align with certain political viewpoints. You've talked about personal responsibility, traditional values, faith-based solutions to social problems. These aren't exactly politically neutral positions." Denzel shifted in his chair, his composure still intact but his patience visibly wearing thin. "Stephen, I think you're conflating personal beliefs with political activism. When I talk about faith or family or education, I'm talking about principles that transcend party lines. I'm not telling people how to vote or which candidate to support." "Come on, Denzel," Colbert said with a dismissive chuckle that echoed through the studio. "We both know that in today's climate, talking about traditional values and personal responsibility is coded language. It's political, whether you want to admit it or not. And frankly, some of your comments have sounded pretty conservative to me." The word conservative hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in the interview, Denzel's mask of diplomatic professionalism began to slip. His voice dropped to a lower register, carrying the weight of decades of experience and hard-earned wisdom. "Stephen, I think you need to be very careful about putting words in my mouth and labels on my beliefs. I've spent my entire career trying to uplift people, to tell stories that matter, to be a positive influence. If believing in hard work, education, and strong families makes me conservative in your book, then maybe we need to examine what those labels really mean." Colbert sensed he had struck a nerve and decided to push further, his journalistic instincts overriding any sense of propriety. "But let's be honest here, Denzel. Your recent comments about young people needing to pull themselves up and your criticism of what you called victim mentality, these are talking points straight out of a certain political playbook. You can't have it both ways." The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Denzel's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and disappointment as he stared directly at his host. "You know what, Stephen? I think this interview is over." But Colbert wasn't finished. "Oh, come on, don't do that. Don't pull the 'I'm too good' for this conversation card. You came on this show knowing we discuss real issues here. If you can't handle having your positions challenged, maybe you shouldn't be making public statements about complex social issues." The tension in the studio reached a breaking point as Denzel slowly began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Don't you dare walk away from this conversation," Colbert snapped, his mask of late-night comedy finally slipping completely. The audience gasped audibly at the unprecedented breach of television etiquette. "You come on my show, make these grandiose statements about doing your homework, and then you can't even defend your own positions when pressed?" Denzel paused, his hand frozen on the microphone clip. The veteran actor had weathered decades of Hollywood politics, faced down directors, producers, and critics. But this felt different. This was personal, and it was happening in front of millions of viewers. He slowly looked up at Colbert, his eyes burning with a controlled fury that sent chills through the studio. "Defend my positions?" Denzel's voice was quiet but carried the weight of thunder. "Stephen, the only position I've taken is that people should think for themselves and take responsibility for their lives. If that's controversial to you, then maybe the problem isn't with my message." Colbert leaned back in his chair, his posture aggressive and dismissive. "Oh, please, spare me the high-minded rhetoric. You're not some neutral observer commenting on the human condition. You're a wealthy Hollywood actor telling working-class people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps while you live in a mansion. Don't you see the irony in that?" The attack was personal now, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Denzel's publicist, sitting in the audience, looked visibly uncomfortable, whispering urgently into her phone. The show's producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but Colbert seemed oblivious to everything except his target. "You want to talk about irony, Stephen?" Denzel stood up slowly, his full presence commanding the stage. "The irony is you sitting there, in your comfortable studio, making assumptions about what I believe and where I come from. You don't know my story. You don't know the projects I grew up in, the struggles my family faced, or the work I've done in communities you've probably never even visited." Colbert's face flushed red, his competitive instincts taking over completely. "Oh, here we go with the 'I grew up poor' narrative. That's convenient. Use your backstory to deflect from the fact that your current messaging aligns perfectly with people who want to cut social programs and tell minorities to stop complaining about systemic racism." The words hit the studio like a bomb. Several audience members audibly gasped, and the uncomfortable shifting in seats became a low rumble throughout the theater. Denzel's composure, legendary throughout Hollywood for its unshakable nature, finally cracked. "Now you're putting words in my mouth about race?" Denzel's voice rose for the first time, carrying a power that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "You're going to sit there and lecture me about the black experience in America? You're going to tell me what my message means to my community?" Colbert, perhaps realizing he had crossed a line but too deep into the confrontation to back down, doubled down with a sneer. "I'm just pointing out the logical conclusion of your rhetoric, Denzel. When you tell people to stop making excuses and take personal responsibility, you're essentially saying systemic problems don't exist. That's not my interpretation. That's just basic critical thinking." The studio fell into a deadly silence. Even the cameramen seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away. Denzel stood perfectly still for a long moment, his breathing controlled but his eyes blazing with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "You know what your problem is, Stephen?" Denzel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried crystal clarity through the silent studio. "You think you're so much smarter than everyone else that you can tell a black man what his own words mean. You think you can psychoanalyze my motivations and explain my experiences better than I can." Colbert shifted uncomfortably, perhaps finally sensing he had pushed too far, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "I'm not trying to explain your experiences, Denzel. I'm trying to understand how someone with your background can promote messaging that ultimately hurts the very communities you claim to care about." "There it is," Denzel said, shaking his head with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "You just can't help yourself, can you? You have to be the white savior explaining to the ignorant black man how his own beliefs are actually harmful to his people." The accusation hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with decades of unspoken tension about race, privilege, and media representation. Colbert's face went pale, then flushed deep red as the implications of Denzel's words sank in. The audience was completely silent now, some people covering their mouths in shock, others pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming television history. "That's not what I'm doing," Colbert stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I'm not trying to be anyone's savior. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the impact of public messaging in our current political climate." Denzel let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the studio. "Honest conversation? Stephen, you ambushed me. You brought me on here under the pretense of discussing my career, then immediately started attacking my character and putting me in political boxes. You've spent the last 10 minutes telling me what I really mean when I speak about my own experiences." The show's band leader shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and several crew members were now openly staring at the train wreck unfolding before them. The red recording lights seemed to pulse with an ominous rhythm as Colbert struggled to regain control of the situation. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," Colbert said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that only made things worse. "But you have to understand that when you make public statements, especially as someone with your influence, those statements have consequences. They get interpreted and used by political movements, whether you intend it or not." Denzel's expression hardened further. "So now you're telling me I should censor myself because other people might misuse my words? Should I run my thoughts by you first, Stephen? Should every black celebrity check with white liberal gatekeepers before speaking about their own communities?" The question cut through the studio like a blade. Colbert's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't dig his hole deeper. The pause stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with only the hum of studio equipment filling the silence. "That's not what I'm saying at all," Colbert finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm saying that public figures have a responsibility to consider the broader implications of their messaging." "And who decides what those implications are?" Denzel shot back. "You? The media? Twitter? When did we decide that celebrities should be politicians first and artists second? When did authenticity become less important than political correctness?" The questions came rapid fire, each one landing like a blow to Colbert's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his position. The host's famous quick wit seemed to have completely abandoned him as he faced down one of Hollywood's most respected figures in full righteous fury. "I think you're mischaracterizing what I'm trying to do here," Colbert said weakly, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead under the hot studio lights. "I'm not trying to silence anyone. I'm trying to engage in the kind of substantive dialogue that our democracy needs." Denzel stepped closer to Colbert's desk, his presence filling the entire stage. "Democracy? You think ambushing guests and lecturing them about their own lives is democratic dialogue? You think putting words in people's mouths and then attacking them for those words is substantive?" The audience was now completely transfixed, witnessing something that felt more like a public execution than a television interview. Several people were recording on their phones, and the energy in the room had shifted from uncomfortable to electric, with tension. "You want to know what's really going on here, Stephen?" Denzel continued, his voice gaining power with each word. "You can't handle the fact that a successful black man doesn't fit neatly into your political narrative. You can't comprehend that someone who looks like me might have different thoughts, different experiences, different solutions than what your ideology demands. Colbert's composure finally cracked completely. That's ridiculous. I have plenty of black guests who don't agree with me politically. This isn't about race, it's about intellectual consistency. Intellectual consistency? Denzel's voice rose to fill every corner of the studio. You want to talk about intellectual consistency? How about the consistency of respecting your guests enough to let them finish a sentence? How about the consistency of not ambushing people with gotcha questions designed to make them look bad? The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing, facing each other across the desk, like gladiators in an arena. The studio cameras continued, rolling, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. "You know what, Stephen?" Denzel said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I came here tonight thinking I was going to have a conversation with a professional. Instead, I find myself being lectured by someone who thinks he knows more about my life than I do." He began gathering his composure, straightening his jacket with deliberate precision. "This isn't journalism. This isn't even entertainment. This is just arrogance disguised as intellectualism." Colbert, realizing the interview was slipping completely out of his control, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Denzel, please, let's just take a breath here. We're both passionate people discussing important issues. That's what good television looks like." The veteran actor turned to face Colbert fully, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "Good television? Stephen, you just spent 20 minutes trying to tear down someone who came here as your guest. You've questioned my integrity, my authenticity, and my right to speak about my own experiences. And now you want to call it good television?" The audience watched in stunned silence as Denzel completely removed his microphone, the small thud as it hit the desk, echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Several audience members were now openly recording the confrontation on their phones, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Let me tell you something that might actually educate your viewers," Denzel continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in Hollywood for decades. "Real strength isn't about tearing people down to make yourself look smart. Real courage isn't about ambushing guests with gotcha questions. And real leadership isn't about forcing people into boxes so you can attack them more easily." Colbert's face was now visibly flushed, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Denzel, I think you're overreacting to what was just a spirited debate about important social issues." "Overreacting?" Denzel's voice rose one final time, carrying enough power to silence even the most restless audience members. "Stephen, you just spent half an hour telling a black man that his beliefs are harmful to black people. You questioned my authenticity, my intelligence, and my right to think for myself. And now you're telling me I'm overreacting?" The studio fell into complete silence, except for the hum of equipment and the barely audible sound of people shifting in their seats. Denzel looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the millions of viewers watching at home. "To anyone watching this at home, let me be clear about something. Nobody has the right to tell you what you should think or believe, based on what you look like or where you come from. Nobody has the right to put you in a box and then attack you for not staying in that box. And nobody has the right to lecture you about your own experiences." He turned back to Colbert, who was now sitting behind his desk, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him on television. "Stephen, I genuinely hope you learn something from this. Because this isn't about politics or ideology. This is about basic human respect, something that seems to be in short supply around here." With that, Denzel Washington walked off the stage, with the same dignity he had brought to every role throughout his illustrious career. The studio audience erupted into a mixture of gasps, scattered applause, and confused murmuring as cameras followed his exit. Colbert sat frozen behind his desk, clearly shell-shocked by what had just transpired. The show's producers frantically signaled to cut to commercial, but not before millions of viewers saw Colbert's face, pale, sweating, and completely defeated. The man who had built his career on quick wit and sharp commentary had been thoroughly dismantled by a guest who simply refused to be bullied. Within minutes of Denzel's exit, social media exploded with clips of the confrontation. Denzel walks out and Colbert exposed began trending worldwide as viewers shared their shock and admiration for the actor's dignified but forceful response to what many saw as an unprofessional ambush. The incident marked a turning point in late-night television, sparking nationwide conversations about respect, authenticity, and the responsibility of media figures to treat their guests with basic human dignity. For Colbert, it became a career-defining moment that raised serious questions about his future in television. As Denzel Washington disappeared into the New York night, he left behind more than just an empty chair. He left behind a masterclass in how to maintain dignity under fire and stand up for oneself against overwhelming pressure. The confrontation had ended not with violence or screaming, but with truth spoken plainly and powerfully by a man who refused to be diminished.